Welcome to Alternative Dog Moms Podcast. I'm Kimberly Gauthier, the creator of Keep the Tail Wagging. For the past 9 years, I've been blogging about raw feeding, pet wellness, and life as a crazy dog mom. I've seen massive improvements in my dog's health since I started raising my dogs naturally, and I'm passionate about sharing my experience to help other pet parents.
I'm Erin Scott. For the past 9 years, I've been researching and learning everything I can about healing cancer, allergies, autoimmune, and mystery illnesses in both my dogs and myself. And I can't wait to share with you everything I've learned on this journey. As the Alternative Dog Moms, we're bringing you all the latest dog health news that we're following and sharing the tips, tricks, and resources we learn along the way. Now, let's get started. Hello, Kimberly.
Hello, Erin. How's it going?
Good. A little chaotic over here with the new kid, but we're figuring it out.
What's her name?
Nessie.
Nessie.
She came with that name and she knows it, and she just looks like a Nessie.
Okay.
So we are joined today by a very special guest. We have Amy Renz. Hello, how are you?
I'm great, Erin. Thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be with you and Kimberly.
So I'm sure we're going to have a ton of questions for you. So I always just love hearing kind of your origin story. How did you get involved in the pet food industry? Did you always want to be in the pet food industry? How did this all come about?
Sure. So my company's Goodness Gracious. We make human grade, healthy, species appropriate, all that good stuff for dogs and cats. And so, no, this was not my background at all. I was running a small software company up until 2009, 2010 timeframe. So pet food, total right turn, right? But I grew up with dogs. My sister's a veterinarian, and my family has always been embracing companion animals. We had dogs and cats, and I got my first dog in 2007. Her name was Grace. And then about 6 months later, I got my second, Lula. And I think like most people, when they get their first dogs, they become parents, right, for the first time. So when you're a kid growing up in a family with a pet, it's very different than when you become that guardian and that caretaker, right? You become mom. And so I became entrenched in it, committed to it, right? And wanted to do all the right things, right, for my girls. And so 2007 was also when I am older than you, of course. So I don't know if you remember 2007. Probably not, but
I think we're older than you think we are.
but 2007 was the melamine issue, right?
Yes.
Where melamine was in all kinds of pet food. It made a whole bunch of animals sick and died. And then shortly thereafter, there was a chicken jerky problem, right? With chicken jerky originally from China, but we also had the problem here in the States, which gave a lot of our companion animals kidney failure or kidney problems, and which we never got to the bottom of. And then around that same time, there was a large pet food company that got into some hot water for exposing their employees to toxic mold and fumigants. And I became very distrustful of what to feed my girls and angry. And so I started making their food at home. And I did not know then what I know now. So I know I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but that was around 2009 or so, 2008, 2009. And I started realizing along that way too, about how many companion animals we're euthanizing in the US because people simply fail them, right? They are homeless and we don't find them good homes. We have problems with not spaying and neutering, not being actively involved in their health and well-being. And so at the time, it's better now, but at the time it was about 3 to 5 million companion animals every year. And I thought that was really atrocious. And so I turned 40 in 2009, and I started asking myself, who are you helping? And I was building shareholder value at that software company, and I was helping people along in their career paths and all of that. But that really wasn't a lot of comfort when I put my head on a pillow at night. And so I thought that if I could create a company that does something really amazing for the health and well-being of our companion animals, the ones that have homes, and at the same time does something to give back to address this homelessness problem, that would be my answer. And so I created Goodness Gracious in late 2009. We started operating in early 2010, and I describe it as much a company as it is a spirit, because to me, it's about doing something really healthy for our companion animals, but doing so in a way that connects us to each other and to our planet. And so it started out as a business that we were a treat company to start with. And it started out that we were giving 51% of our profits to community animal shelters and rescues. And we continue to do that today, but we do a lot more that embraces and strengthens that connection. So that extends to our selection of the ingredients that we use. And we're mindful about how we source our, not only our proteins, but also our produce, right? In terms of no GMOs and things that are good for our planet. We use a lot more green energy than, your average company. We focus on recyclable packaging and more compostable ways to ship things from here to there. And also we embrace a vibrant culture of diversity in our team. And so it extends to many different ways, and that we improve those connections. But that's where we are today. And in 2021, late 2021, we expanded from treats into food, and so now we make a gently cooked 5 different lines for dogs and 2 for cats.
So I'm actually feeding the rabbit to my guy Nino right now.
Oh, nice.
He's
Yay.
my older guy, and he's had a gallbladder problem, so he's on a low-fat diet. And so rabbit was like the leanest thing that we could find, and so yeah, that's what we've been feeding him for. I mean, off and on with turkey and a couple other things, but right now, literally today, it's rabbit.
Oh, fantastic, Erin! Thank you.
So, what made you go with gently cooked instead of raw?
Hey, quick question for you. Are you someone who wants to be fit, healthy, and happy? And what if I told you you could get your dream body by simply just listening to a podcast? I'm Josh.
And I'm KG, and we're the hosts of the Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast.
Listen, we get it. Fitness isn't easy. Carbs, no carbs.
Just stop, okay? It doesn't have to be that complicated. And that's why we made this podcast. We get straight to the facts so you can become your best you.
So the way to check us out is click the link in the show notes or search Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast on any of the major podcast platforms. We'll see you soon.
Right. So for us, we're a licensed and inspected human food facility. So out of the gate, we have issues with handling and shipping out raw food, right? So I'm not a huge fan of HPP. Mm-hmm. And so for us, and we don't want to, we're not into ultra processing. So we're not a kibble company, and kibble are canned, and we're not, you can call me a control freak, I suppose, but I'm not into freeze drying because that basically means we have to outsource. So, so for us, by process of elimination, we kind of got down to this being the best way for us as a company to make food. But also, there's a lot of really good benefits in lightly cooking or gentle cooking, and I think a lot of times there's this thinking that it's dead food and, as opposed to raw. And that's really not the case. Like we can look at what a lot of the leading holistic veterinarians say about gentle cooking. We can look at the science of it too, and see that there's really a lot of preservation of nutrients in food that's lightly cooked.
Mhm.
And there's also some benefits that we can get out of lightly cooking as opposed to raw.
It feels like it's more accessible to a lot of people. I mean, he's gone now. Rodrigo passed away a couple months ago, but he, in his last couple years, preferred a gently cooked diet to a raw diet. And I found that veterinarians, especially for those of us who live more in a rural area, we're going to traditional veterinarians, and they're more amenable to a gently cooked diet than they are a raw diet. And for people who are new to fresh food, it's easier to get them on board with a gently cooked diet than a raw diet, because it feels like it checks so many different boxes beyond just nutritionally.
Right. Right. I would agree with that. I think that it is easier for some dogs to digest.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's that. It's, humans eat cooked food and we don't suffer malnutrition or poor health because of light cooking methods, right? Westerners have obesity and metabolic and immune and inflammatory related diseases out the wazoo, right? But we have those issues because of overnutrition and the toxicity of ultra processed foods. So that's not what light cooking is. So light cooking would be like steam or sous vide or poaching or blanching. It's the application of short heat or of low heat for a short duration. And so, there are many leading holistic veterinarians that recommend those kinds of diets for compromised dogs or for older dogs, because it's just easier for those dogs to process those kinds of nutrients.
When it comes to like the FDA or AFCO, is there any hurdle that you've encountered? Like, is it easier to have lightly cooked versus raw when dealing with those kind of organizations?
I agree 100%. I would say yes. I think that the FDA, not AFCO, because AFCO is really just they write the regulations, but they don't enforce anything, right? But FDA, in my personal opinion, has really singled out raw pet food companies and put them under a lot more intense scrutiny for things like pathogenic bacteria than they do with ultra processed foods. I mean, ultra processed foods, I think Susan Thixton reported on this, that ultra processed foods came right out and told the FDA, the big pet food companies, we can't make kibble without there being pathogenic bacteria problems. And 98, I think, % of all of the recalls for pathogenic bacteria in the last several years have been kibble, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really not raw food, but yet those are the raw food companies are the ones that the FDA tends to come down on, and also is very vocal about issues or concerns about cross-contamination with pathogenic bacteria. I think people are smart, right? And I think they go to a grocery store and they buy a pound of raw chicken and they know that they have to wash their hands and they have to wash their cutting board and they have to wash their knife and all of that kind of stuff. And I think when they buy raw food, they know that too. But the FDA, for whatever reason, does not give them credit for that, or maybe they have other motives. I'm not
Well,
sure.
I honestly think that people like to take, and I see this across just the world in general, where people like to take this small minority of people who are doing it wrong and attribute that to everyone. So years and years ago, when I used to do events like, the Pet Expo and stuff, and it's my way of telling people about raw, and gosh, those were miserable days, full-on days of, trying not to argue with people, and just, being polite, and it was just miserable. But I remember once a friend did it with me, and we're sitting in our booth, and I returned, I was speaking at the event, and I come back and she was like, we were behind, Bainfield Vet. And they were just having a field day about how horrible raw feeders are and how disgusting we were and all these type of things. And I get back to my booth and I could tell she's agitated. And she does not have a filter at all. So she was just like, I'm just going to sit here and not say anything. And so I was just like, I'll go and talk to them. So I went around and was just like, introduced myself and was just like, I understand you guys were talking about raw feeders. And as a raw feeder, I would love to join this discussion. Two of the veterinarians just immediately walked away, but one decided to have that conversation with me. And the amount of misinformation he had was astounding. And it really gave me pause about it's like we're on two different sides of a huge chasm, as far as what they think we do and what they think we should be doing versus what we do. And that chasm, or on that side of the chasm, is what they're making their rules based on. So it's just sort of like, you have a handful of people who are like, dogs need bacteria. It's good for them. You don't have to worry about this. And so they just assume that everyone's like, oh yeah, bacteria is all over our house. We don't clean anything. And so they're just like, yeah, those raw feeders, they're pretty disgusting. So when it's just sort of like, yeah, you guys can manage to make a turkey dinner for Thanksgiving without killing the whole family.
Right.
But for some reason, the second we decide to start feeding our dogs, all of that knowledge has gone out the window and we're just disgusting.
With your sister being a veterinarian, was she someone who was into this kind of more integrative whole foods movement, or did she think you were crazy?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I have to say, at the start, she thought I was woo-woo. Her perspective has broadened now, and she feeds her dogs the foods that we make. But in the early days when she saw me making food at home for my dogs, and she thought I was, it just wasn't for her, right? She was feeding her dogs pretty much out of a bag, right? Out of a dry food. And when we started talking about, what I had mentioned earlier with kibble being responsible for most pathogenic bacteria recalls, she was shocked to learn that kind of stuff. And in the defense of conventional veterinary medicine, I think what a lot of doctors are exposed to is the mantra of big kibble companies, right? Because these are the ones that are wining and dining them like they're pharmaceutical companies, taking them out to dinners and so what they hear is that, byproducts, that's really just liver. Like, no, it's
Oh my gosh, that's so true. I not to interrupt, but I am going to interrupt. I'm a blogger, and so there's a huge pet blogging community. And when I started writing about raw feeding, it was just basically Kimberly has gone left field and she's drank the Kool-Aid. She's drank the Dogs Naturally magazine Kool-Aid and she's just gone crazy. But someone actually wrote an article about byproducts, which were just, raw feeders don't like byproducts, but they feed their dogs byproducts all the time. And it's like, that's not true. We don't go and sweep up the floor of a kibble company and then throw that into our dog's food and call it raw feeding.
Right? I know, it's crazy. So there's a huge study done by pet food industry trade associations in 2020, and they looked at, I think it was like 1,235 dog foods and 500 something cat foods, and the ingredients by tonnage that went into them. And, so this is industry reporting on itself. And what they said was that 90% of what goes into pet food is corn, soy, or rendered byproduct. Like, that's them, right? And so, that stuff is not what's going into raw food. That's the stuff that's going into that ultra processed stuff.
Yeah, I heard your conversation. I'll put a link in the show notes with Angela Ardolino on her podcast. We don't need to get into it. But it was a graphic description of what rendered means.
Rendering is, right?
And I had a hard time getting through it, I'll be honest.
I know. Yeah, it's pretty awful. It's pretty awful. But,
So I look at your ingredients, and one thing that I've noticed with a lot of cooked food brands is the use of white potatoes, and you do not use white potatoes. Yet your food, it looks like what anyone at home would make. I mean, it looks like
food.
Yeah, it looks like food, like crock pot food. Why is it that so many people use white potatoes, and why did you choose not to?
Oh, I think white potatoes, there's a lot of problems with white potatoes. They're really turn into sugar really easily. So they're high glycemic, right? So they fuel inflammation. They are loaded with glyphosate. So they're one of the more heavily treated crops in terms of chemicals. I think they're used a lot because they're inexpensive. And when you're trying to hit from a manufacturing perspective, when you're trying to hit a certain price point that people will buy something at, you have to find cheaper ingredients to use. And so it's basically a filler, but it's not something that I like, or, I purposely set out to avoid, right? I purposely set out to avoid anything white potatoes, any kind of grains. Our foods have a glycemic load of 1. And so we use a little bit of carrot in terms of a root vegetable that's no more than 5%. And we use a little bit of sweet potato in a couple of our recipes at no more than 3% by weight of the recipe. So all of our foods have a glycemic load of 1. And that's really important to us because, all of that high starch stuff is at the root of obesity and metabolic dysfunction, right? Where you start to have high blood sugar, and that is at this vicious cycle of metabolic syndrome, right? It's obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which puts a body at risk for a whole bunch of other problems, not the least of which is cancer. And so it was super important to us to avoid any kind of starchy food, and potatoes are right there.
Yeah.
In that bucket.
So when you're talking about going from a treat company to a food company, and you're scaling, and you're trying to source quality ingredients and also remain at an affordable price point, like how long did it take you to kind of put that all together, to be able to do that?
Right. So when I've been wanting to do food for a long time. We came out with it, like I said, in late 2021, but it had been on my radar for several years. And I don't think, for us anyway, the market maybe hadn't matured enough. Because if you look, gently cooked foods have really only taken off in the last few years, right? I think it was really Farmer's Dog with their Super Bowl ad 2 years ago, right?
We've talked about that.
Really put it in mainstream. So, but it's always a work in progress, right? Because the one thing about food prices is that they never stay the same, right? They're always rising. We're along with COVID, there was a huge bird flu epidemic, right? Which caused chicken and turkey prices, duck prices, to any kind of bird, poultry prices to quadruple. And so, and for there to actually seriously be a chicken shortage, like you wouldn't think that there would be a chicken shortage, but there was. And so it's always a constant battle, right? And it's tough when you're a manufacturer, because most of the time you have to take that hit to the margin when it happens, because you're locked into pricing, right? Our pricing for our food pretty much stays the same, whether or not it's on a shelf in a pet supply store or it's on our website, right? But we are tied tightly to commodity price. So like the price of chicken or the price of spinach or whatever that is. When it goes up, our margin goes down, because we really just can't increase our margin at the same pace. So we pray for good suppliers and good sourcing, and try to do our best with that kind of stuff. And when you make food, you can't just swap out ingredients, right? You're making a complete and balanced food, and you got to stick with the program, right? Because you're committing to a a nutritional profile, right? That looks like this, and not just from a macronutrient standpoint, but from a vitamin, a mineral, a fatty acid, an amino acid standpoint. And I find it fascinating. And maybe we're a lot different. Maybe we're a rarity in that respect, because I was listening to, I'm a member of the Inside Scoop, right? Rodney Habib and Dr. Becker, and they're doing this 4-part series on review of pet food, right? So they just covered, I think, 14 kibble brands. And part of their review, they seek out the AFCO nutritional profile from each one of the manufacturers that they review. And most of those manufacturers, I was shocked, would not release that information, right? And so maybe they're swapping out ingredients and swapping around their recipe and all of that. But I think that's a long answer to your question, Erin. We work with nutritionists, we work with veterinarians, and we come up with a formulation that is something that we personally want to feed our companion animals, like period, the end. And if it's not something that I'm going to feed my dog, I'm not going to make it. And so, and then we just try to make it as affordable as we can for folks, and that probably means that we're not getting the kind of margins that a big kibble company is getting, right? But we're doing the right thing. At least that's what I think.
How many of the ingredients do you make yourself? Like, do you guys actually grow your own sprouts?
No, we don't. We use the only sprouts we use are an organic sprouted sunflower seed, and so we buy those from a company. So we don't grow any of our own ingredients. We source them from good suppliers. So,
and speaking of which, let's talk about vegetables, because one of the things that just really struck me when you spoke at the Feed Real Summit was everything that you had to say about vegetables and glyphosate. And before listening to you, I tried to do organic, but it just wasn't really a priority to me. But after listening to you, I became an organic, just junkie. And I also, I am terrified of feeding spinach, because the more I look into just how vegetables are grown, I couldn't find any spinach unless I grew it myself or a friend is growing it in their garden, organic or not, that wasn't being subjected to chemicals. Yeah. And so can you speak on that?
Sure. So glyphosate was approved for use in 1974, right, as an herbicide, and its use has accelerated in our country with not only the advent of GMOs, but the way that we use it. Right, we use it as a desiccant and to ripen crops just before harvest. So about a third of U.S. cropland is treated with glyphosate, some 300 million acres, and it's especially scary for pet parents, because 85% of the glyphosate that's used in our country is applied to the plants that make up about 96% of those plant-based ingredients that go into pet food. So, we're talking about potatoes, corn, soy, rice, dried beans and peas, peanuts, like in peanut butter kind of stuff. And so it goes on about 12 or 13 different.
That was it. It was the peanuts. I love peanuts. Love them so much in the shell. And I will just sit and crack shells and eat peanuts all day long. I don't go near them now. And so when I came home, I drove from store to store looking for organic peanuts and could not find them anywhere. And so now I'm doing organic cashews.
Oh, good. Yeah. But glyphosate is, it's recognized as being cytotoxic, so toxic to our cells, mutagenic, carcinogenic, genotoxic. It was, and it is, a large correlational study was done in 2014, and it mapped glyphosate and GMO crop data to over 20 different chronic diseases, 6 different types of cancer, diabetes, obesity, and it found an extremely high correlation between those things and those diseases. And then in, I want to say it was 2021, 13 researchers out of Europe discovered that glyphosate that's administered within Europe's acceptable daily intake for humans, which is about 1/6 of what it is here in the United States, disrupts the balance of gut bacteria through the same pathway it destroys weeds. So it's the pesticide of the microbiome. And when you start farting around with your microbiome, right, and creating a leaky gut, you're now exposing yourself to all kinds of diseases. I mean, the gut is really the center of our health. It's tied to our brain. It's tied to our immune system. It's tied to our metabolic health. And so appropriate choices when it doesn't all have to be organic, right? You can go a long, long way by eliminating or choosing organic on just maybe the 12 or 13 crops that are those ones that receive the majority of glyphosate. And if that's where your budget, like if you don't have this endless budget, that's where you start, right? To make some really wise choices. So yeah, there's this list that I've put up, I think on like Instagram and our blog that has the list of those 12 or 13.
The Dirty Dozen.
Yeah. It's not actually the Dirty Dozen. It's a little bit different than the Dirty Dozen because it's focused on glyphosate, but there's a lot of similarities to it. And when you add things like cotton and almonds into the mix, you pretty much account for all of the glyphosate that we use in the country. So, so we tend to, or we like to look for fruits and vegetables that are not those glyphosate crops, right? And then we also like to look for ones that do a lot of different and really good things for the body. So not only help with metabolic health, because there's this epidemic of disease that begins with obesity, right? About 60% of our dogs and our cats are obese. And that just triggers this cascade of problems. So when we can start to address those kinds of issues, then we can go a long way. So we like to look for vegetables like dark leafy greens, broccoli. I like spinach because it has a lot of vitamins and minerals in it that are really good for us. But kale, Swiss chard, some blue and red fruits, right? Those are all really good things that support really good cellular signaling in the body, decreases in inflammation, helps us fight cancer, all that kind of stuff. And really surprisingly, and back to your original question earlier about cooking, those things stand up really well to cooking, as long as you're not burning the crap out of it, right? Or boiling it forever. Amino acids and minerals are largely unchanged in a light cooking process. About the only mineral that you might see some degradation or loss in is chlorine. And that just is because it tends to dissipate in water. So over time, chlorine will kind of go away. When you cook, you might lose maybe 10% of that. But vitamins will average around 25% loss in gentle cooking. And the most sensitive ones are B1, so thiamine, B12, B6, you might lose 40 to 50% there. So if you're cooking, you want to make sure that you're introducing other foods or more foods that make up for that. Vitamin D, B2, B3, B5 are probably about 10 to 20% loss. And vitamin E and choline are probably around 30%. Fats, though, if you're talking about a really lightly cooking method, you're probably not going to have any destruction there, but you might see anywhere from 0 to 20% loss with those. And those would be like your really fragile omega-3s that you could see. But so when we make our food, one of the things that makes us different is that we don't combine everything and then cook it. We steam each ingredient separately, and that allows us not to cook certain things. So we don't cook our fats, right? We add them at the end when everything's cold. And we don't cook our fruits, and we don't cook those sprouted sunflower seeds, because those things are a really great source of vitamin E for us. And we want to preserve that. So about the only things that we do cook are we steam our vegetables so they can become more digestible, because our dogs really can't, they don't masticate like we do, right? They don't chew stuff. So, and they don't have that enzyme in their saliva that would enable them to digest things like carbohydrates and stuff. So, so we like to steam that. And we also do lightly steam some of our protein so that we can at least go through that kill step, that pathogen step. So we heat them to an internal temperature that would be sufficient for killing that kind of bacteria. And then we stop it and rapidly chill it. So through that kind of process, we don't see a lot of destruction in our nutrients.
What about the oxalates in spinach? That was always been my concern is, I get messages from people all the time who say, they're worried about the oxalates. Is that something that we shouldn't be concerned about, or is it more for dogs that are more prone to stones?
I think it's dogs that are prone to it, and that like people is a very small percentage of the general population. And also, when you make sure that the diet is a fresh food diet, they're getting adequate or they're getting a lot of water, right? So in their food, so they're not a dry food fed dog. So get access to water in the food and in the bowl is going to help prevent any problems with oxalates. And also when you cook like spinach, you're losing you're eliminating about 50% of the oxalates that are there. So it's generally only a problem in a small percentage of dogs.
Interesting.
So you had mentioned, like, for instance, that you use the sprouted sunflower seeds as a source of vitamin E. So I think I've heard you say that all of your like vitamin things like that are based on whole foods and that you don't use synthetics.
Right.
Can you talk about the use of synthetics in other foods and why you don't do that?
Yeah, for sure. I love talking about this kind of stuff, right? So our food is 100% whole food, right? It's complete and balanced to AFCO's profile using 100% whole foods. And so bodies don't recognize synthetics, and they don't behave the same way as the nutrients in whole food. So a great example from this, and one that's gotten a lot of attention recently, is copper-associated hepatopathy, right? So Dr. Sharon Center is a veterinarian out of Cornell, and she called copper-associated hepatopathy an avoidable and tragic nutritionally provoked canine illness that stems from AFCO's 1997 change to highly bioavailable copper chelates that at levels that exceed the physiologic tolerance for many healthy dogs. And so a copper chelate is essentially copper that's bound to an amino acid to make it more bioavailable. So natural copper, which would be found like in oysters and beef liver, right, has a bioavailability of about 30 to 40%. Chelated copper, on the other hand, has a bioavailability of about 80 to 90%. And not only that, but unlike natural copper, which mammals are really good with regulating. So it seems like the more they ingest, the less they absorb, they eliminate excess in the stool. Copper chelates are not that way. They bioaccumulate in the liver. So even in healthy dogs, even in dogs that are not genetically predisposed to have copper storage disease, we're seeing increases in copper-associated hepatopathy because of the use of copper chelates in pet food. So, that's one particular problem. Another one, phosphorus is used widely in pet food. Its highest levels are in all life stages and puppy formulas, and synthetic forms of phosphorus are associated with kidney disease in long-term use. So natural forms of phosphorus have a bioavailability of about 40 to 60%. Synthetic forms, it's found largely in meat, right? So, but synthetic forms have a bioavailability of 80 to over 100%. And these are things like phosphates, right? So they're the kinds of things that you would find in cured meats and processed foods and soda, right? And that's what AFCO allows to be the phosphorus source in pet food. And so synthetic phosphorus does a number of different things. It rapidly increases, unlike natural phosphorus, synthetic phosphorus rapidly increases phosphorus levels in circulation in the bloodstream. And that can cause calcification of soft tissues like in your blood vessels and in your kidneys. And so when you start to damage your blood vessels, right, those endothelial cells, those tiny little cells that line your blood vessels, you're causing a lot of damage that can cause metabolic dysfunction, right? High blood pressure, cholesterol problems. You can have immune-mediated problems because of damage to your blood vessels. Those little endothelial cells are responsible for exchanges between your tissues and your bloodstream, and so they're super important. Phosphorus, synthetic phosphorus, can also increase parathyroid hormone after ingestion. And that's important because parathyroid hormone activates vitamin D in your kidneys, and that puts calcium into circulation. And so when you have hypercalcemia, then you can start to see problems with cholesterol regulation and insulin, proper regulation of insulin, sodium retention, high blood pressure. So, these things, it's not just a simple replacement of a synthetic for a whole food. It's, I sat across the table from, he didn't know who I was. He was a big muckety muck with Purina, and he was meeting with a whole bunch of veterinarians and tried to tell them the same line I've heard from a lot of people in big pet food. And it's that the ingredients don't matter. It's the nutrients that do. Right. And that's not true. Right. I mean, synthetic phosphorus is not the same thing as natural phosphorus. Ingredients make a difference. There's probably about 5 or 6 synthetics that are on my, do not like list, right? And copper would be one of them. Phosphorus is another. I don't like synthetic choline. It's and vitamin D. We have huge issues with vitamin D. So vitamin D, most dogs are actually deficient in vitamin D, according to a big test that was done by Tufts. They looked at about 300 plus dogs that ate, it was like 40 different foods, including homemade. And they found that all diets provided insufficient levels of vitamin D for dogs. And, the vitamin D is important for so many different reasons. It's tied to metabolic health. It's tied to immune health. It is a risk factor for cancer. So one of the really scary things about vitamin D, and it's something in synthetic forms of it, is it's something that pet parents would never know to ask and could never get any assurances on, right? And it's that the chemical structure of that vitamin D really matters. Like if that vitamin D is a microencapsulated form versus a water-soluble micellized form versus an oil-based form or crazy ethanol-based form, right? That can affect utilization in the body by as much as 2 to 5 times. So, when that label says synthetic vitamin D, well, what form is it actually in, right? And is my dog getting enough of it? Fortunately, there are some tests out there that pet parents can now run. So VDI Labs does a test that with a blood draw that you can check your dog's vitamin D levels. And so that would be something that I would ask my veterinarian to do at my next visit, because vitamin D is super important.
When you take care of your own dogs, do you do these different testings?
I do. Yeah, I do. It's I've done glyphosate testing on them. Cause my mantra, I guess, is, well, who is it? President Reagan, right, said trust but verify, right? So, right. So I want to know what their glyphosate levels are, and I was super pleased with what I see. I mean, I think dogs are always going to have, with outdoor exposures, right? Unless you've got some little guy that really just stays home all the time. Dogs that go out and play in parks and sniff grass and drink out of puddles and all that kind of stuff are probably always going to have higher glyphosate levels than we do. But Dr. Erin Bannock is one of 3 practicing integrative veterinary oncologists in the country. And she has as a goal for her patients to get them down to 2 part per billion or below for glyphosate. And she's able to achieve that through organic produce. And I think she uses mostly a raw food diet. My dogs test at right around 1 part per billion, which I think is really good. The average dog is somewhere around 16 part per billion. It's just, It's really crazy. So and the average human, I think, is somewhere around 0.5 part per billion. So there's a real big.
When it comes to organic vegetables, how do we know, like when we're at a grocery store, how do we know that it's truly organic?
Oh, that's a good question, Kimberly. And I don't know if I don't
throwing it in that section.
I don't know if I have the answer for you. I mean, I suppose you could send it away to a lab, right?
I've reached a point where I
feel bad by the time you get your answer. And
yeah, today I have the day off. And so today I'll be driving down to the fancy grocery store, which is a few cities south of us, just to get my vegetables, because I trust that their stuff is organic. But it's like my just regular local grocery store. Sometimes I look at it and it's just sort of like, are you really organic?
Right. I suppose. And I also think sometimes you can tell by the size and the coloring of things, right? I mean, sometimes organic produce is just smaller, right? I mean, it's just, those massive honking apples, right? They're the ones that got the chemicals. I really want the small ones, please,
Yeah, I've started every summer I grow a garden, just a container garden filled with vegetables. And I just spend all summer harvesting and grinding vegetables to freeze just so that I know my vegetables are organic. But even then, I mean, it's like it goes back to the seed and it's just sort of like, good Lord, are these seeds organic? I mean, all of it is so overwhelming with all the steps that we have to go through to find non-GMO, organic, minimally tampered with foods just to be able to feed ourselves and our dogs because we don't want to eat a chunk of chemicals.
I know. I agree. I do think there are some things too that we can add to our diet that can help with that, right? I mean, we're going to be exposed to toxins just because it's in our food supply and it's in the air we breathe. But I started using I guess I'm going to give a shout out to a company, but I started using Ions, their TerraHydrate. So it's that pump. It looks like water. It kind of looks like brownish tinted water, right? But it's got fulvate or humic acid extract in it that is supposed to help repair gut lining and protect gut lining. So I've started using that in my health and with my dogs. We each get squirts of it every morning. And so there's that. We recently started using, goodness gracious, chlorella in one of our recipes, right? Because it's one of those really green superfoods that helps bind heavy metals and eliminate heavy metals from your body. So yeah, I mean, in the absence of being able to verify that what we're eating is truly organic, I guess we add other things into our diet to hedge our bets, right?
Yeah. I am become a huge fan of Gussie's Gut. I just turned practically a quarter of my online content is like, look at there. I'm getting this. I have a video that I'll be putting up today of Bella eating it off a spoon. I mean, I love that product so very much. And it's just sort of like, but yeah, it's one of those where you can, with everything out there that we're learning, it's so easy to go overboard with just basically trying to, metaphorically put our dogs into this healthy bubble to protect them from everything that's out there. But, we can only do so much. And I'm very lucky because I live on land and I live in a rural area. So their exposure to toxins is minimal as compared to other dogs, but it's not
it's not so minimal that I can just be like, go be free. You're
Right.
fine. Because it's just, we live in a toxic world. It's just the way it
Yeah.
is.
One of the really big struggles around here in New England is with ticks, right? I mean, in most of the rest of the country, it's not nearly as bad as it is here. But if you want to give your dogs off-leash access to soil and mental enrichment and off-leash exercise, right? That generally means that you're going to be in an area where there's ticks. And around here, Lyme disease and all of those co-infections are seriously bad. Yeah. And I struggle with that question about those tick preventatives, right? Mm-hmm. And those we know they are awful, right? Awful, terrible, awful, right? Mm-hmm. But so's Lyme disease, right? And I don't think that a lot of people in the rest of the country get how serious the problem is here in New England with that. And I have a lot of compassion that goes out to people on both sides of that. I mean, that can be a very divisive argument for people, or people can get very passionate about it, right? About to use them or to not. And I think we all can embrace how awful they are and agree how awful they are. But, you know, for some people who have had personal experiences, even with dealing with, I mean, I've had that personal experiences with dealing with Lyme disease and co-infections and all of that. And it can be the alternative can be just as bad.
Yeah. And it's like heartworm in the South. Like I would never, judge anybody in this, in Louisiana or something for using heartworm preventives,
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think it's interesting because I know I have a friend in Florida where fleas are superhuman down there. And they practically don't even respond to, well, they definitely don't respond to anything natural. And they have to stay on top of it. They have to do the chemical treatments. And especially if you have a dog that is allergic to flea saliva, this is something that, your dog is either going to be extremely miserable or safe. And so it turns into more of a detoxing and protecting the system, protecting the microbiome while using these products. It's definitely something that I've learned not to judge what other people are doing. I don't mind sharing what I'm doing, but I kind of feel I am in such a, knock on wood, glorious place, because even here in Washington, I mean, my friend, she is a vet tech, and she was like, this was a horrible year for fleas here. And they were starting to see dogs with ticks, something that we really don't experience here. And she was like, oh yeah, it's been horrible. Not me. And it's like, we live on a property that's practically all exposed to sunshine. And my dogs, I barely do anything for, the only thing I really do for fleas is, feed a fresh food diet and throw some garlic in their food, during the spring, summer, and fall. And I have never experienced fleas, or I shouldn't say never, but, it's just not an issue. Oh, and I do the spray, like the Kine and those type of sprays and stuff, but it's really not an issue for me. But I feel guilty because I don't want to lead anyone to think that, oh, so you don't need to do anything in Washington. And it's like, no, you just don't need to do anything at my house. Right. Down the road, my friend was battling fleas all summer long, but at my house we were gravy. So yeah.
So how did you learn all of this? It sounds like you worked in the software industry. So, is it just from your own research, or have you done like formal education? Like how can we all learn this?
Oh, Erin. Yeah, just being an active learner, right? Just reading. I think, when I look at how I spend my weekends, I just love to read. Like I love to learn. And so, yeah, when probably most people are out, I don't know, whatever, but going to a movie, right? Or I do like to exercise. So I do get out there, but I love to read. And so when I was preparing, for instance, for the Feed Real, summit, I thought, I know exactly what I'm going to talk about. And I had connected with Ruby months ahead of time and knew we were going to be doing this. And as I got into it, I thought, oh no, I want to learn more about this and I want to talk about more about that. So I just, I just read. But I like to read some kind of pretty heady stuff, like I love to read scientific studies and all of that. And not necessarily the stuff that, kind of early initiants to pet parents might pick up. Right. And there's a lot of good material that out there too, but no, I kind of the nerdier the article, the more into it and I had a really great time at the AHVMA too. We were there this past October, so it was right before the Feed Real Summit, and we had a booth, so we were presenting there, but we had a couple of people that stayed in our booth, and I just ended up going to a whole bunch of the lectures and that the veterinarians were giving. And so that was like Christmas for me. Just a whole bunch of
Can you attend the AVMA one?
We won't be at the AVMA. No, we're going to do the AHVMA again.
Yeah. Do you do any like conventional vet?
Yeah. I'm always curious about their response.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't really done that. I kind of like to connect with the people who already drink the same kind of Kool-Aid.
I don't want to answer the questions of why isn't there any cornstarch or rice in your food?
Yeah.
Right?
Where's the protein going to come from if there's no cornstarch or rice?
Yeah, aren't you worried about DCM because you don't have any grain in your food? I'm like, oh. Oh my God.
Yeah. Oh, I just have to tell you, we were talking about ticks, and that's a big problem where I am also. And I live very close to a place where there's kind of like this very cool hiking trail through the woods, but we don't always like to go in there because every time we go in there, somebody comes out with a tick on them. And Kimberly has heard me tell stories of how my husband is like obsessed, like he like thinks he spots ticks everywhere and like will be down on his hands and knees looking at my dog's behind to make sure that, she doesn't have a tick in the parking lot of a school, and so we just adopted this new girl, Nessie, and Tim's already had a tick scare with her. That was a false alarm. It was just that she kind of has this little dimple here on her cheek, and it has, I don't know, it looks kind of dark in the center. And so he was already like freaking out and had the flashlight and the tick removal kit. And then he's like, oh no,
like, where am I?
I know, this poor dog is like, what's going on here? But false alarm. We take it very seriously.
Yep, we do. So when funny story. So when we first got Grace, so our very first dog, so I'm married, and we were up at a family cabin. It was a big family gathering up there. And so this cabin has really 2 bedrooms and then a ginormous loft, which has multiple beds in it. So we were kind of a communal sleeping area, right? So my husband and I were relegated to one of those beds of this loft, and we had Grace between us. And so she's just a puppy, and it's the middle of the night, and New Hampshire woods are surrounding us, and I'm petting her, and I'm like, Tim, I think I feel a tick. I feel a tick. And he's like, oh, where? And it's pitch dark because we don't want to turn the lights on, right? And he's feeling, I'm like, oh my God, that's a tick. That's a tick. I'm like, no, I think it's a nipple. Is it a nipple? And meanwhile, the people next to us, like in the next bed, I'm like, we hear you. It's like, oh, alrighty, well.
Oh my God, this is hilarious.
And on that note.
Oh my gosh, well, thank you so much for your time today. This was so much fun.
Likewise. Thank you.